So it was meant to be an exciting day yesterday, but it was actually really boring, and that's kind of a good thing. So Quasar upgrade activated a little bit later than we expected. When we set the date and time, we forgot to factor in, we were aiming for 2 p.m. London time. We forgot to factor in that daylight saving changed between now and then. And we also forgot to factor in the thing that everyone forgets to factor in with these upgrades, which is the fact that MTP time is actually about an hour behind real time. So didn't quite happen when we had originally planned, but it did happen. So I'll just briefly recap, I guess, the story. We had an operations room set up yesterday where we had direct contact with probably 99% of the miners. Many of the Chinese mining pools were all together with us in a chat room, and we sat there waiting for the activation time. Once it had kicked in, we had the Satoshi shotgun ready to go because we needed to lock in the activation. The only real change, the only consensus change in this particular hard fork was the changing of the block size. And because we were doing something kind of new and novel this time around, we were changing the default to 2 gig and the miners were going to 512. We didn't write an automatic kind of configuration change mechanism into the Bitcoin SV node because this is probably the only time we're ever going to do this. So what we needed to do was wait until activation time ticked over and then get every single pool to very quickly reboot their nodes with the 512 meg setting. The reason why we wanted to do that quickly was because until that happened, there was a very, very small window where someone might have been able to come in and mine a bigger block, and then we would have had a very short-term hash war on our hands. But that didn't happen. Everybody switched their configurations pretty much within the space of about a minute. And once we were sure that that had happened, then we started up the Satoshi shotgun. What we saw happen was the Chinese firewall came into play, and a whole lot of nodes that were on the Chinese side were not getting the transactions from the shotgun as fast as the ones on the other side. So CoinGeek actually switched a whole bunch of their miners from that were based in China over to mining on a pool outside of China. So that we had a large amount of hash pointed at a node that had a nice fat mempool. And as I'm sure most of you know, it didn't take very long before we mined 147 meg block, which was quickly followed by 2 others. And then we had a very nervous hour after that, because as soon as we hit the 147 meg block, CoinGeek switched their the miners I mentioned before back over to China. And as it turned out, it was just pure random variance. But towards the end of the hour, we were starting to get a bit nervous and go, oh God, did we break something? But as it turned out, no, we didn't. More blocks started to get mined on top of that. I was ready to call it and feel like completely comfortable, as in comfortable enough to go to bed once we had 20 on top of the big block. The main reason for that is because in the last couple of weeks we've had an unknown miner who's been hash switching a lot, switching chains quite a bit. They were taking advantage of the fact that there were dips in difficulty happening on the Bitcoin SV blockchain that essentially made it more profitable to mine Bitcoin SV. So they were coming in with a huge amount of hash rate, mining like 20 blocks in an hour, and then once they pushed the difficulty back up, they'd bugger off back to wherever they came from. So we did factor that in as well, and a group of miners actually raised the difficulty over the day or two before the Quasar activation was due, to ensure that it wasn't profitable for anyone to do that during that, that kind of critical time. So We had one small pool that appears to have forgotten to upgrade their software. I'd never heard of them before now. They show up on Coindance charts as unknown, but you can look at the Coinbase and it says warped pool. I'm not sure if they've noticed yet, but when they do, they're going to be a little bit disappointed when they realise that the block that they mined is, well, they made themselves a new blockchain, but I'm not sure anyone's going to be willing to buy the coins that they have on their brand new blockchain. But other than that, it appears to have gone well. I've not heard any reports of any services that had service degradation or fell over or failed, with the exception of one block explorer owned by BTC.com, who we think have recently been mining Bitcoin SV, but they seem to be a little bit embarrassed about it and don't want to put their name in the Coinbase string. So we can't be 100% certain, but their block explorer is sitting there reporting the highest block is the one that Warp Pool mined from yesterday. So I think that's probably the bulk of what there is to report. Maybe I'll just sort of talk about what the Quasar upgrade actually means, and I've spoken about this. I've written about this fairly extensively on the bitcoinsv.io blog page. But it really does represent a shift in the way that Bitcoin governance works. The Bitcoin SV team took a very active decision to do it this way. It's quite unusual for us to go and change the default to a number that we know that the miners aren't going to actually be using. And the reason for that was twofold. One, because what happened in March of this year was unexpected. We hit the 128 meg cap quite a while before we expected that we would, and that was largely because of the fact that we weren't taking into account data transactions and how easy it is to kind of embed large amounts of data in the Bitcoin SV blockchain. But Bitcoin caps, Bitcoin caps aren't really meant to be there at all, but if they are, they're never meant to be hit. And we made this argument many a time last year that the cap is not about, it shouldn't in any way reflect what the sustained usage of a chain is. It should be like 50 times that amount. It's there to, as a kind of an emergency stopgap, but it should not be impeding it shouldn't be impeding the sustained rate of transaction usage, but more to the point, it shouldn't be impeding peak rates either. If there's a sudden burst of traffic and the software can handle it, then we should be accommodating that. So 2 gig was 4 times what we planned to be doing around about this time, but the reason for that is that we think there's a really good chance that we'll be able to make use of that kind of capacity between now and February next year. The miners themselves are being a little more conservative with their 512 meg cap, but they now actually have the freedom to be able to raise it without accidentally forking off every listening node that's out there on the network. So I wouldn't expect this 512 cap will necessarily stay in place for the whole period between now and February of next year. If it appears reasonable to do so, then miners will probably get together and maybe they'll agree on a time, or maybe they'll just sort of do it one by one and start raising that to a higher number. So this is really important because this is kind of the way that Bitcoin is supposed to work. Bitcoin was never meant to have block caps in place at all, but the capacity of the network was meant to be a kind of an aggregation of what all of the miners collectively were capable of dealing with, kind of on average or as a median, I guess. So it's a big cultural shift, not just because that's new behavior, but it's a cultural shift because it's new behavior that needs to be learned. There aren't that many miners out there that really know how to manage this because they've never had to before. And I think it's probably been easy over the last 10 years to just leave it in the hands of developers. There's probably many reasons why developers are motivated to be happy with that as the status quo, because it keeps a lot of power in the hands of the developers. When we say it was an active step, or you know, a very, very conscious decision, part of that decision was around going, well, in part it was about giving the miners a bit of a kick up the butt and say, guys, you need to start taking care of this. And in part it was about the developers saying, we're actually not going to anymore. So someone has to, and you guys are pretty much, you miners are the only ones that can. So I feel like that message has been heard loud and clear, and I think it's been welcomed by the miners. We've had a lot more engagement from miners, both the ones that are well known and friendly to nChain, as well as others that we've never really had much contact with before, reaching out and going, okay, well, you know, how do we manage this? How do we handle this? They're kind of looking for a little bit of guidance, but they're definitely showing a willingness to take on the responsibility that they need to take on. So I think that's probably enough of a commentary, I guess, on this from me. I think I might. There's other things I can ramble on about, but I know there's probably a few questions about Quasar or what's coming up next. So I might throw it out to see if there's any Q&A that needs to happen.
Thank you.